Well, welcome back one last time for the week. This is the History of the Restoration Movement PowerPoint Archives. This is going to be module number 12. And in this module, we will discuss the early life and ministry of Thomas Campbell. Now, Thomas Campbell is one of the premier movers and shakers in the Restoration Movement. Not to be confused with a shaker, but Thomas Campbell is going to be so significant that we will only be able to cover the first part of his influence today. So we are specifically going to cover everything from his early life in ministry all the way down till his separation from the Presbyterian Church, which will be when he will pen his famous document, the Declaration and Address. Now, the Declaration and Address is going to be one of the major assignments you have to do a paper on this semester and critique. So I'd like to spend just really all of this module to just set the stage for what caused Thomas Campbell to compose this document. And so we're going to be looking at, again, his early life and his ministry, all the way up to his move to America and the difficulties he faced preaching on the American frontier as a Presbyterian. So we should probably begin by noting that Thomas Campbell was born on February 1st, 1763, in a Northern Ireland town known as County Down. Now, keep in mind that this will make Thomas Campbell fairly unique among many of the restorationists in America, primarily because he will be from Europe. Of all of the people we've looked at so far, only O'Kelly had a European background, and O'Kelly will make the move to America before the Revolutionary War. Campbell, on the other hand, will come after the Revolutionary War. And so he won't necessarily be breathing the same we fought for our independence kind of free air that the rest of the Restoration Movement founders will be breathing. Now, don't get me wrong. He will breathe in quite a lot of that freedom, especially once he comes to America. But it should be noted that he will bring many of his European sensibilities with him, and that will make him both unique and allow him to give certain ideas to the movement that could only have come from an educated European mind, at least in this time. Now, it should be noted that Thomas Campbell is born an Anglican, which is, to me, even more amusing because Anglicans are not a normal part and parcel of the Irish Church. Most of Ireland is still Roman Catholic at the time. So to even be born an Anglican would have made him a minority in Ireland. However, Campbell will seem to dislike the cold formality of the Church of England, and he will convert to the Presbyterian Church. And it is difficult to say exactly when this conversion happened. Campbell will, like many good Presbyterians, be able to produce a conversion experience where he will have found himself wrestling with his own inadequacies and fears of an almighty God, and that he will suddenly have those fears relieved. Very Amazing Grace style Presbyterianism happening here. And so his fears will be relieved. He will have this conversion experience, and that will be enough to suffice to make him a member of the Presbyterian Church. Now, eventually he is going to get the call to go study in Scotland. It's unclear whether he initially thought he was leaving to be become a preacher or whether he was just simply wanting to get an education. But he will certainly travel to Scotland, the home of the Presbyterian Church. And so many of the ideas he will soak up while in college will be strongly based on a Presbyterian identity. And he will end up studying here, the University of Glasgow. Now, please note the picture below that this is an extremely wealthy school, even for its time. That many of the buildings, which are old and marvelous today, were expensive and impressive when Thomas Campbell was there. This is clearly one of the better educational institutions that Scotland had to offer. And I'd also like to point out that this will mean that Campbell will have more formal education than any Restoration Movement founder we've discussed thus far. And this will be very important because Campbell will be able to bring a sophistication to the Restoration Movement that just simply wasn't there before. So, while at Glasgow, Campbell will study under Dugald Stewart, who was a fairly prominent Presbyterian and philosopher. And we'll discuss more of the influence of Stewart at a later module. But for now, it will be enough to say that Stewart will help Campbell integrate a philosophy known as Scottish common sense rationalism into Campbell's mode of study. Now, we really can't get into that much in this module, but let us just say that it is a philosophical position that allows one to study the Bible scientifically, while not necessarily doubting many of its stronger claims. And this will be a major facet of the debate going on in most of Europe during the time that the Restoration Movement is really starting to launch, is this question of, can we study the Bible scientifically? And if we do, may that compromise traditional orthodoxies? And one of the benefits of the Scottish common sense rationalism is that it will allow a person to do really both, to approach the Bible in a scientific way, but at the same time avoid many of the skepticisms that are emerging at this time. So he will attend Glasgow from 1783 all the way up until 1787. Now, almost immediately after he's done, Campbell will choose to continue his college education and will study at Whitburn Seminary. Now, a seminary is specifically a place that a person goes to be trained for the ministry. So, certainly by 1787, Campbell had it in mind to go and be a Presbyterian minister. Now, it should also be noted that this is a seminary that specifically trains Presbyterians to be anti-burgher seaters. And so, keep in mind that this is not the seminary you would go to study to be a part of the main line Presbyterian Church. This is one of the seating offshoots of Presbyterian. And again, all of this is simply to say, and I don't think I can stress this enough, both of the Campbells, Thomas and his son Alexander, will go through Scottish college education. And this will bring an educated edge to the Restoration Movement that simply was unavailable to most Restoration Movement founders on the frontier. If you wanted to study religion or philosophy, you really had to do that at a private institution on the frontier. Very few people are going to have the time or the resources to go to Boston, to go to New Jersey to study at a Yale, Harvard, or Princeton. And so keep in mind that by having this level of education, the Campbells will be able to bring something to bear that simply was not there before, and that is a college education, the ability to study the Bible scientifically, and a familiarity with biblical languages, particularly the Greek and the Hebrew. And this will allow them to tackle questions in a mode of biblical scholarship that is much more common to us today than would have been common on the American frontier. So, continuing on with Thomas Campbell's life, in 1787, in addition to choosing to go to seminary, Campbell will also marry a young lady named Jane Carneigle. And within a year, their first son, Alexander, will be born. Now, this will be the first of 7 Campbell children. And Alexander, in many ways, by the time the Restoration movement is really rolling along on the American frontier, Alexander Campbell will step in and pretty much take the reins of leadership. But for now, it will suffice that Thomas Campbell is going to be making a living as a preacher all the way from the beginning of Alexander Campbell's life. And this will be important because it will mean that Alexander Campbell will grow up foundationally in the Presbyterian Church, knowing that his father is a minister. And there's going to be many kind of, we'll call them spiritual disciplines, Thomas Campbell will expose Alexander to early on. That every Sunday he will ask Alexander and the rest of his children for a summary of his sermon. There will be daily and weekly scripture memorization. There will be daily and weekly Bible readings and Bible study. And all of this is simply to say that Thomas Campbell will train Alexander and all of his children in a way that would really give them a jump start on doing ministry if that's what they chose to do with their lives. So, by 1791, Campbell will have earned his divinity degree. He will become an ordained Presbyterian minister, and they will send him back to Ireland to be a minister at several small churches. And eventually, he's going to settle as the located minister of Ahore Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And this is going to be very important. It's going to mean that Campbell is going to be doing his ministry in a Scottish church in a foreign country. And this will begin to have many implications as he begins to expand his ministry across Northern Ireland. So as this ministry begins to take off in Northern Ireland, Campbell will become more and more frustrated by the divisions in the Presbyterian Church. Specifically, he'll be frustrated by the divisions between the Burghers and the Anti-Burghers. And by 1806, this is really going to become kind of Campbell's main issue that he wants to deal with. And he will be extremely proactive about trying to solve the divisions between the Burghers and the Anti-Burghers. Now, simply put, in Ireland, there are no town mayors. There's no mayoral system where an Irish person has to make a burgher oath. There's no need for a burgher allegiance. So Thomas thought, this schism is really ridiculous. There's no reason to have a burgher or anti-burgher in a place where no one is going to ask you to make a burgher oath. And so, because this could not be reproduced in a foreign country, Thomas Campbell is going to approach several Burgher Presbyterians, and he is going to suggest that maybe the schism could be ended for the sake of doing Presbyterian evangelism in Ireland. Now notice, he's not asking to solve the schism in Scotland where it's actually a problem. He is simply saying, why can't we just let it be and join together in Ireland, because there's really no burgher oath complicating things here. Now, surprisingly, in Ireland, Thomas Campbell will be very successful in negotiating with these groups. The Burghers and the Anti-Burghers of Ireland will both agree to Thomas's proposal, and at the presbytery level and at the regional synod level in Ireland, the Burghers and the Anti-Burghers will draw up a proposal for their union in Ireland. Now, Thomas, unfortunately, has to take this proposal, cross the Irish Channel back to Scotland, and he's going to have to submit this proposal to the Scottish Presbyterian General Assembly, and they will vote on it. Now, the General Assembly of Anti-Burghers, of which Thomas is a member, is still very much in the middle of the heated Burgher-Anti-Burgher debate. And so, to them, it is a matter of showing party loyalty that even across the way in Ireland, that the Burgher and Anti-Burgher distinction remain. And so they will vote and they will reject the Irish merger, basically citing that it is not right for the Anti-Burghers to have communion with heretics who will sell out and make the Burgher oath. Now, again, Thomas will find this absolutely ridiculous, because the Burghers in Ireland haven't sold out. There is no one they have to make an oath to. And so really, we are condemning the Burghers in Ireland for a hypothetical situation, that they would swear a Burgher oath if one was presented to them. But again, the ridiculousness of this is, how do you honestly say someone is a heretic for a hypothetical situation? It really doesn't make much sense that a person can be declared a heretic based on what they would do as opposed to what they have done. Now, just for an interesting kind of shot to kind of rub a little salt in this wound, the Anti-Burgher General Assembly will eventually approve a merger in 1820. But this will be about 8 years after Campbell has officially left the Presbyterian Church. So, just kind of insult to injury, what Thomas was always fighting for, the end of the Anti-Burgher-Burgher rivalry, will find its consolation in 1820. But by then, it's going to be too late for Campbell to really enjoy it. So, fed up with the situation in Ireland, Thomas Campbell will start to become physically ill. Now, around the same time, about 1807, he will receive a letter from several of his friends from Ireland who have made the move to America. And they will write back to Thomas and say, "You should come to the States. It is great here. Much ministry is being done. There's a start of a revival out on the frontier, and it's starting to move its way into the East Coast. Why don't you come to America?" Now, Campbell is going to do something pretty, I guess, amazing, for lack of a better term, that in April 8th of 1807, Campbell will pack up and move to the United States to be a Scottish Presbyterian missionary in the United States. And in doing so, he's not going to be terribly financially secure at this point in his life. And so he will leave his wife and his 7 kids in Ireland so that he can go to America to be a missionary. Now, this separation is only going to be for about 2.5 years, and Alexander Campbell is roughly around the age of 20, so it's not like he has left his wife and abandoned his kids. Alexander is at an age where he is going to be able to take over his father's school, where his father was also teaching at on the side. And in short, Alexander will step in and fulfill the adult man-of-the-house role. But it does say something about Thomas's character, that when he sees a ministry opportunity, he is willing to sacrifice closeness with his family, including his wife, in order to see it through. Now, kind of an interesting turn of events. Now, Campbell has no way of planning for this, but he will arrive in America on May 13th of 1807. And it just so happens that that same week, the Anti-Burgher Cedar Presbyterians, their synod will be meeting in Philadelphia, which is the capital city of Pennsylvania. And Campbell will present his credentials to that presbytery, basically saying, I am a licensed ordained Presbyterian minister in Ireland. I am in good standing with the Anti-Burgher Synod. That's all his credentials will say. And he'll present those on Friday. By Monday, the Philadelphia Synod will assign him preaching duties at the Chartiers Presbytery in Washington, PA, across the state, just south of Pittsburgh. This will mean that Campbell will have to go out on the wagon trail from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and then a little bit further south near the mountains of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and set up shop and begin a circuit riding preaching. And he will begin this by June of 1807. Now, also keep in mind that this is going to place him near the Ohio River. And this will be important because the Ohio River is as we talked about in an earlier lecture, is one of the main communication and travel waterways to get to Kentucky. And so word of what is happening with the Barton Stone Christians in Kentucky will slowly but surely start to trickle its way up the river. And Thomas Campbell, and eventually Alexander Campbell, when the rest of his family joins Thomas a little later, will be in this area in Washington, Pennsylvania, and will have access to this communication. Almost all of this is simply because he was in the right place at the right time in Philadelphia to present his papers and get a preaching assignment out in the middle of the frontier. So, as unlikely as it sounds, we have a Presbyterian who is college trained, properly ordained, who can speak and read in Greek and Hebrew, and here he is on the American frontier. And this will be important because almost every movement of this first generation of the Restoration movement, almost every major player is going to get their start on the American frontier. Now, while he's at Washington, PA, preaching for the Chartiers Presbytery, Campbell will make a pretty gutsy and, for lack of a better word, unorthodox move. Campbell will decide to start ministering to any Christians he can find. And he really won't ask denominational questions. Because one of the things Campbell will find when he is out here is that in rural Pennsylvania, in the middle of the frontier, that many Christians of this area will not have a regular pastor. Sometimes their pastor has died. Sometimes they've just moved so far away from their home church, there's really no way to have access to their pastor. And one of the things that Campbell will note is that many of these Christians on the frontier have not had communion in quite a while. But Campbell has an issue. As a Cedar Anti-Burgher Presbyterian, Thomas Campbell cannot serve communion to anybody except someone who falls in that designation. At least that is the official policy of the Anti-Burgher Cedars. Well, Campbell is going to kind of throw a little caution to the wind, and he is going to make a decision to have open communion anyways. Now, for a simple definition of open communion, it's very similar to the don't ask, don't tell policy of the military of the 2000s. And it's going to go like this. Campbell will offer communion to any Christian, and he won't ask for a show of paperwork or a show of basically the common Scottish test to show whether or not a person is a proper Presbyterian. And so, for Thomas Campbell, all Christians will be invited to participate in the bread and the cup, regardless of denomination. Now, there is some confusion about whether or not he opened this up only to Presbyterians, or whether he opened it up to all denominations. It is clear that Campbell did have a habit of listening to other Baptist and Methodist preachers in the area. So we can't necessarily rule out that he also offered them to have communion. But it is just interesting to note that this choice for open communion will not go over well with the Presbyterians as a whole. In fact, the Presbyterians will be so infuriated with him that by October 27th, about 3-4 months after he began preaching in 1807, they will file charges of heresy against Thomas Campbell. And they will do this so that they can remove him from his pulpit ministry. Now, the Presbyterians are going to accuse Thomas, specifically the Presbyterians of the Chartiers Presbytery, will accuse Thomas of 7 things. 1, that they will deny that he is denying saving grace. And by this they mean that he is basically saying that he is denying that you have to have a religious experience in order to confirm that you've received saving grace or faith. Second, they will say that he is denying a need for a confession of faith, and specifically that he is not making the Westminster Confession the scale by which we judge whether a person is a Christian or not. Now, a third charge against him is they're going to say that he has allowed non-ordained Christians to participate in worship. And by this, they explicitly mean he has allowed non-Presbyterian, anti-burgher seaters to participate in the Lord's Supper. A fourth charge, they will say, is that he has made a habit of occasional hearing. And by this, they mean that he is listening to other people preach who are not Presbyterians. Okay? A fifth charge against him is that they will say that he taught that Jesus was not subject to precept or penalty of the law when dying for humanity. Basically, they're saying he has taken a non-Anselmian view of the cross, meaning that he is basically denying that this is a propitiation, that what Christ is doing is he is offering a propitiation sacrifice to God. Okay? The sixth charge against him is that they will basically claim him of, or say that he is influenced by Methodism and is teaching that humans could lead a sinless life, which as a Presbyterian, a person who is, if you're a Presbyterian, you believe in total depravity, in which case a person leading a sinless life is absolutely ridiculous. And the last charge, and this may be where the initial charges came from, is that he has preached in Mr. Ramsay's territory. Now, Mr. Ramsay is another Scottish preacher, and we don't know for certain what it was that he had done in Mr. Ramsay's territory. But the fact that Mr. Ramsay is the only person named in this whole list, to me indicates that it may have been Mr. Ramsay that got this whole thing rolling, basically infuriated that Campbell has stepped on his toes and preached in his jurisdiction. So, what were Thomas Campbell's responses to these charges? Well, to the first charge, he is going to simply say that a religious experience does not constitute saving faith or a reception of grace. And to be honest, this is a very old light way of putting it. Basically, the old lights will be skeptical of the revivalism in general, and they will see that many of these revivals are trying to provoke someone having a religious experience. And he's simply going to say, no, a religious experience by itself does not constitute that a person suddenly has saving faith. His second response is going to be that a confession of faith should not be made a shibboleth of the faith. Now, he of course is referring to a passage in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, one of the judges is going to become angry at one of the tribes of Israel for failing to aid him in a war. And so they will basically guard the border between his tribe and their tribe. And anyone trying to cross this border must say the secret password, shibboleth. But because the people from the other side of the border apparently sound their letters out differently, they say the word sibboleth. And of course, we instantly know which side of the border they belong on, and if they're on the wrong side of the border, this judge would have them killed. Thomas Campbell uses this idea, and I think he says it in a very profound way. We should not use a confession of faith to say who belongs on the correct side of the Christian, non-Christian border. That we may have to make a judgment call of, is this person a Christian or not? But the confession of faith, and specifically the Westminster Catechism, all 12,053 words of it, do not make for a fair assessment of whether a person is a Christian. Now, the next two charges, the charge that he has allowed non-Presbyterians to participate in the Lord's Supper, and that he has made a habit of listening to other preachers preach, he will simply affirm, yes, I have done that. And to be honest, he is not very remorseful. If I could put words in his mouth, he would probably have also said, and I'll probably continue doing it as well. Now, the next two charge, that he denies the propitiatory nature of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and that he is teaching that humans could lead a sinless life, these two charges he will deny, basically saying, no, he has not been compromised with an alternative view of Christ on the cross, and he has not been compromised by the Methodist idea of entire sanctification. So he may have departed from some of the ideas of the Westminster Catechism, but he has not went so far that he is starting to associate with either the Methodists as far as their ideas of sanctification, or as far as, say, the Eastern Orthodox and their ideas of alternative atonement theories to the Anselmian theory. And then finally, in response to preaching in Mr. Ramsey's territory, Campbell will simply affirm that, yes, he did preach in Mr. Ramsey's territory, but he was invited to somebody's house. He was not preaching in anyone's church. He was not preaching in any organized place. And so he feels that this was unfair to be charged with invading someone else's territory when he was simply invited over to somebody else's house. So here, after these charges have been filed, it will take several months for the proceedings to happen, but in March of 1808, Thomas Campbell will be officially suspended by the Chartiers Presbytery. Now, it is interesting to note that Campbell, at least initially, plays by the rules. He's been suspended. He will stop preaching. He will make an appeal to the Philadelphia Synod, and probably about half of that 2-month span, he'll be spent traveling to Philadelphia and back again. But it should be noted for the record that when he is properly suspended, he does not show any of the signs of a true maverick, and by just saying, well, you can't make me stop preaching, I'm just going to go out. He plays by the rules of the presbytery. And I find this to be a somewhat noble characteristic of Thomas Campbell, that when he wanted to mend the Burgher Anti-Burgher problem in Ireland, he went through the proper channels. And now that he has had his preaching assignments taken away from him by the Chartiers Presbytery, he is going to appeal this decision instead of simply just preaching anyway. Now, he's going to meet the Philadelphia Synod, and he will respond to all of the charges there. And the Synod, for the most part, will clear his name. Any charges that he does admit to, they will basically give him a slap on the wrist. So much of a slap on the wrist, in fact, that it is questionable whether they actually thought he had done anything wrong at all. That they were just simply following protocol of saying, bad boy. Well, he will then be reassigned back to the Chartiers Presbytery. He will travel back to the presbytery, but the presbytery will then defy the order of the Philadelphia Synod and still not allow Campbell to resume his preaching duties. They will have, in a sense, taken away the papers that he has saying that he is good, and they will not allow him to preach. Now, it's interesting to see why the presbytery would defy the synod, considering the synod technically is over them. Did they think that because they were rural enough and so far away in the frontier that the synod would not come to them or would not really press the matter? It's hard to say. But what is certain is that Campbell will feel that this is a very big slight because, as I pointed out, Campbell plays by the rules. And he currently has paperwork from the synod which outranks the presbytery, saying he should resume his preaching responsibilities. With this, the Chartiers Presbytery is basically refusing to play by proper Presbyterian etiquette. And ultimately, this will leave Thomas Campbell very little choice. And so, by September of 1808, Campbell will officially withdraw from the Chartiers Presbytery. Now keep in mind, this does not mean that he is withdrawn from the Presbyterian Church, just simply that he is withdrawing from the presbytery at Chartiers. However, this will present Campbell with a pretty significant problem. He's still in Washington, PA, and there's no other presbytery that Campbell can appeal to. He is simply going to resume his preaching duties, because if Chartiers isn't going to play by the rules, why should he? But by May of 1809, he will start to get pressure from the Presbyterian Church and the Philadelphia Synod, basically saying you either have to play by the rules of the Chartiers Presbytery, or you have to go somewhere else where another presbytery will take you. But by this time, Campbell has quite a following in Washington area, and as a popular traveling preacher, he is disinclined to give up the place where he is currently working and making pretty good inroads. Now, it should be noted that two of Campbell's favorite topics to preach on seem to have been rejecting creeds as the standard of faith, which is very suspect for a Presbyterian, and the call for Christian unity, which is, again, as we've pointed out in previous lectures, not a very Presbyterian thing to say or do. So, at least for this lecture, this is where we are going to leave Thomas Campbell, that he is now outside of the Presbyterian Church, and he is looking for, well, what comes next? And ultimately, he is going to found what is known as the Christian Association of Washington. This will be a group of Christians who, for the most part, are still Presbyterians, with the point of view that they will listen to Campbell, they will hear him preach, they will get spiritually fed, but they will still continue to have fellowship with their other Presbyterian churches. And so, if you want take-home points, here are the things really up to this point that you need to know about Thomas Campbell. The first is that it is the divided nature or status of the Presbyterian Church that will really offend Thomas Campbell, that he will see there's really no need for all of these divisions in the church, especially outside of Scotland, because all of the divisions are based on church-state arguments, not about doctrine. And so Thomas Campbell, throughout almost all of his preaching life, will work tirelessly for reconciliation with the Presbyterian Church. Even after he is officially disbarred from the presbytery, he will still make several overtures during his life in order to try to reconnect with the Presbyterians, because this is how seriously he takes the idea of Christian unity. That even when the church has said, Thomas Campbell, go away, he will still say, I think unity is important enough that I still need to have my hand out to you. And I think this shows a type of character that is seldom seen when a preacher of Thomas's stature is really just kind of shafted and shown the left foot of fellowship. That he is still there graciously saying, can't we fix this somehow? And it should be noted that all of Thomas Campbell's early attempts at reconciliation are within the system motions. That he is not rejecting authority of the presbytery outright. Now, as he begins his study of the scriptures by himself without the authority of the presbytery looming over him, he will eventually start to reject a lot of what the presbytery stands for. But just for the record, let it be known that Thomas Campbell is not a maverick of the Bartonstone variety, or the Richard McNamara variety. He is not the kind of person who's going to say, well, if I'm being persecuted by the Synod, well, that must mean all I have to do is leave and start my own thing. Campbell is much more graciously wanting reconciliation, and he will display this quality throughout all of his life. And it should also be noted that it's really only in America that Campbell can be opened up and freed up enough to try some of his more extreme unity measures, such as offering open communion, even though he knows that this is a blatant defiance of Presbyterian policy. So, within the next couple of months, Thomas Campbell will produce probably the most important document of the Restoration Movement. And we will spend an entire module just discussing this document, the Declaration and Address. But keep in mind all of these issues, because they will help to explain why Thomas Campbell says what he says and why it's important to him. Why is this unity thing so crucial, even in the midst of calling for a very strict call back to the Bible as the only source for Christian faith and doctrine?